Her son left her waiting, alone at the dialysis clinic, while he drank mimosas with his wife. Helen Mercer, widow, mother, and once too forgiving, didn't call him twice. By Tuesday, his name was erased from her will, her deed, and every account he once claimed by blood. She'd raised a son, not a legacy for the ungrateful. The charities she'd quietly admired now stood where his name used to, and when he came looking for his inheritance, he found a signature that spoke louder than blood. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Helen Mercer sat in one of the vinyl lobby chairs, coat folded neatly across her lap, purse strap looped twice around her wrist. Outside, the December air was the color of wet concrete, and every time the clinic's glass door hissed open, a gust of damp pine and car exhaust crept inside. Most of the other patients were already gone, wheeled out by spouses or guided toward cars by adult children. The place had gone quiet, except for the hum of the vending machine in the corner, and the faint, steady drone of the dialysis machines behind the closed treatment room door. David's silver sedan was supposed to have pulled up half an hour ago. Janine Ross, her nurse, passed through on her way to the front desk, a clipboard balanced on her arm. She stopped short when she saw Helen still sitting there. Still waiting, Helen's lips curved into something polite. "Looks that way." Janine leaned against the desk, peering through the glass at the mostly empty parking lot. "Want me to call someone for you?" Helen reached into her purse and retrieved her phone. "I'll try David first." The line rang twice before his voice came through, bright and cheerful, the sound of clinking glassware in the background. "Hey, Mom, what's up?" "I'm at the clinic," she said evenly. "Still waiting." From somewhere on his end, Melissa's voice pierced through. "Another round." The words were coated in a syrupy cheer meant for the brunch crowd, not for Helen. David chuckled. "Yeah, we're just out for a bite. Thought you'd be fine for a little while." "You knew my session ended at noon," Helen said. She didn't raise her voice, but the air around the words felt cold. Right, he said quickly. "We'll wrap up soon." "No need." She cut him off, pressing the call's red button before he could add a performative apology. Janine raised her brows. "Want me to call a cab?" "That's all right." Helen pushed herself upright, the ache in her legs a reminder of the hours in the reclined treatment chair. "I'll manage." The door opened with its soft hydraulic sigh. A green hatchback rolled into the loading zone, its paint dulled with age but the windshield spotless. Ruby Collins stepped out, her red knit hat slightly crooked, her mouth set in a line Helen recognized, irritation tempered by loyalty. "Get in," Ruby called. Helen approached, one hand on the doorframe. "I didn't text you." "I know," Ruby said, helping her inside. The heater hummed, warm air brushing Helen's shins. The car smelled faintly of cinnamon gum and potting soil. "Janine sent me a message. Said you'd been sitting out here like a lost penny while your boy was busy at brunch." Helen buckled herself in. "It's fine." Ruby's eyes narrowed as she shifted into drive. "It's not fine. You've got a son who treats you like a backup plan, and a daughter-in-law who probably didn't even remember what today was. Not fine at all." Kaylin turned her gaze to the passing park. Forsyth's moss-draped oaks leaned over the sidewalks, the gray-green canopy swaying gently in the coastal breeze. A runner in a neon jacket slowed to a walk. Dogs tugged at their leashes, a child in a yellow raincoat stomped in a puddle near the fountain. Ordinary life unfolded while she sat in Ruby's passenger seat, her own life quietly reshaping itself in her mind. They stopped at a red light. Ruby's fingers drummed against the steering wheel, her gaze fixed ahead. After a moment, she spoke again, her voice lower. "Let me ask you something." Kaylin turned slightly toward her. "What's that?" Ruby looked at her fully then, the question sharp in her eyes. "You still have them in your will, right?" The words hung between them in the warm cabin, heavier than the silence that followed. Helen didn't answer. She wasn't sure yet if she wanted to. Helen set her purse on the hallway table and walked straight to the bedroom, her mind still caught in the echo of Ruby's question. The apartment was quiet except for the muffled chatter of tourists drifting up from Forsyth Park below. the occasional bark of a dog, and the faint creak of her own floorboards. She opened the roll-top desk tucked against the wall, its wood polished to a soft sheen from decades of use, and pulled out a thick navy blue binder. It was heavier than she remembered. She carried it to the bed and sat, the mattress dipping under her weight. The faint scent of cedar from the desk clung to the pages as she opened the binder to the section marked estate planning. Her fingers, still cool from the winter air, found the will, 4 crisp pages, neatly clipped together. Her own name appeared at the top in tidy block letters, followed by the neat legal language she had once read carefully but hadn't touched in years. She flipped to the last page. There it was, in black ink: David Mercer, sole heir. The date at the top stopped her. 10 years ago. 10 years in which she had lost her husband, survived surgery, started dialysis, and watched her son grow less like a companion and more like an occasional obligation. She let the binder rest in her lap for a moment. Outside, a trolley bell rang, the sound drifting faintly through the open slats of the blinds. Somewhere in the park, a saxophonist started playing, the slow notes curling into the air like smoke. Helen reached for the phone on her nightstand and dialed a number she knew as well as her own, Alan Whitford's office. He answered on the second ring, his voice calm and steady as always. "Helen, what can I do for you?" "I need to make some changes to my will," she said. There was the brief rustle of paper on his end. "You know you can update it any time you like. No one has to be notified. The new version simply replaces the old one." Helen's eyes flicked back to David's name, still as final looking as the day she signed it. "Good," she said. "I'd like to come in." Alan suggested Tuesday afternoon. She agreed, jotting the time in the small spiral notebook she kept on her desk. Before she closed the binder, she flipped to the empty notepad section at the back. The tip of her pen hovered over the paper for a moment before she began to write a list. Names of places she'd quietly admired over the years. Savannah Literacy Fund, Historic Oaks Preservation Society, Meals for Seniors of Chatham County. The names looked strangely alive in her handwriting, more so than any of the legal phrases she'd just read. In the kitchen, she made herself a cup of tea, letting the kettle's whistle pierce the apartment's silence. She carried the mug to the small table near the window and sat watching the light fade over the park. The oak's long shadows stretched across the grass, and joggers now moved in the dim orange glow of the street lamps. She thought about the brunch table David and Melissa were probably still sitting at earlier in the day, clinking glasses, telling stories that didn't involve her, maybe laughing about how she'd figure something out like she always did. The tea went lukewarm in her hands before she returned to the bedroom, slid the will back into the binder, and tucked it into the desk again. This time she felt no hesitation, closing the roll top with a firm click. That night, she read a few chapters of a mystery novel in bed, the kind with just enough tension to keep her eyes moving but not enough to keep her awake. Still, as she turned off the light, Alan's voice from earlier replayed in her mind, steady, unbothered, certain. And then, as if sensing her pause over the phone earlier, he had added one more question before they'd hung up. "Want me to start drafting a new version?" Helen had barely set her tea mug in the sink the next morning, when a knock came at the door, firm, rhythmic, and unmistakably Ruby. She opened it to find her neighbor in a quilted jacket, cheeks flushed from the brisk air, holding a paper grocery bag like it was contraband. "I'm going with you tomorrow," Ruby said without preamble, stepping inside. To Alan's office. Helen blinked. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Ruby said, placing the bag on the counter. The faint scent of lemons rose as she untied the knot at the top. "But I want to." The certainty in Ruby's tone warmed Helen more than the tea had. "Tomorrow it is," she said. They settled the time, 3 o'clock, and as soon as Ruby left, Helen moved to her desk. She slid the roll top open and retrieved a manila folder, the one she hadn't touched in years. Inside were the documents Alan would need: the apartment deed, bank statements, her driver's license, and a neatly typed list of her accounts. She laid them out on the bed in perfect order, smoothing the edges until they lined up square. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from David. "One day we should sell that apartment. Prime location. Imagine the profit. Helen read it twice, the words pricking like nettles. She typed back, "It's a beautiful place. I'm happy here," and left it at that. No hint of what she was about to do. By late afternoon, the smell of baking drifted into the hallway. Ruby reappeared carrying a glass dish, the lemon bars still warm, powdered sugar melting into a thin glaze on top. "Appointment fuel," Ruby announced, setting them on Helen's kitchen table. Helen laughed softly. "You spoil me. Someone has to." Ruby poured them both coffee, the rich aroma filling the small kitchen. They ate in companionable quiet, the tart sweet lemon cutting through the bitterness of the coffee. Through the window, the park was cast in the gold of late winter sun. Joggers passed in flashes of neon, children's laughter lifted over the sound of a busker's guitar. It all felt strangely cinematic to Helen, as if the day were pressing itself into her memory for safekeeping. Ruby set down her fork and leaned back. "You've been carrying this decision for a while, haven't you?" Helen met her friend's gaze. "Long enough to know it's the right one." Ruby smiled, a mix of mischief and approval. "Then tomorrow we start rewriting your future." The words landed with quiet finality, like the first page of a new chapter that no one else knew was being written. The next afternoon, the winter sky over Savannah was a soft pewter, the kind of color that made the Spanish moss hanging from the oaks look darker, older. Ruby drove them downtown, the hum of the heater mixing with the faint scent of lemon from the container of leftover bars in the back seat. Alan Whitford's office sat in the corner of a brick building from the late 1800s, its tall windows reflecting the muted light. Inside, the air smelled faintly of leather and old paper. Shelves lined with neatly labeled binders framed the room, and a polished walnut desk sat near one of the big windows overlooking the street. Alan stood as they entered, his hand extended and his expression warm but professional. "Helen, Ruby, please, have a seat." Helen lowered herself into the high-backed chair opposite his desk, Ruby settling beside her. Alan's fountain pen lay across a folder in front of him, its gold clip catching the light. "So," he said gently, "what's brought us here today?" Helen folded her hands in her lap. "David was supposed to pick me up from dialysis last week. I waited for half an hour before I called him. He was at brunch with Melissa." Her voice was even, but there was no mistaking the steel underneath. Alan's brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't interrupt. "I got a ride home with Ruby," Helen continued, "and on the way I realized my will is over a decade old, and my life is not the same as it was 10 years ago." Alan nodded once, the gesture slow, deliberate. "It is entirely your choice who receives what when the time comes. You're under no obligation to keep anyone in place." Helen reached into her folder and slid the relevant page across the desk. "I'd like to remove David Mercer as sole heir, and distribute my assets instead to a few organizations I've listed here." Alan reviewed the paper, his eyes scanning the names: the Savannah Literacy Fund, the Historic Oaks Preservation Society, Meals for Seniors of Chatham County. "These are good causes," he said. "We can make that change today." He opened a fresh document, the quiet scratch of his pen filling the room as he drafted the amendment. Ruby leaned back slightly, glancing at Helen with a small approving smile. Outside, a trolley rolled past, its bell a soft chime against the muted traffic noise. When the pages were ready, Alan rotated them toward Helen. "Read it over carefully. Once you sign, this version becomes the legal document. The previous one will no longer apply." Helen read every word, though she already knew her decision. The black ink where David's name once appeared was gone, replaced by a simple clean line of charities. She picked up the pen, feeling the weight of it in her hand, and signed her name with slow, deliberate strokes. Ruby took the pen without hesitation when Alan asked her to witness, her signature looping with a flourish. Alan gathered the papers, placed them into a protective sleeve, and walked to a tall filing cabinet. The metallic click of the lock sounded final. "It's filed," he said, returning to his desk. He handed Helen a sealed envelope. "Here's your copy. Keep it somewhere safe." Helen slid it into her folder. her fingers resting briefly on the flap before closing it. She felt a lightness, like the first breath after stepping out of a crowded room. They stood, and Alan walked them to the door. "If you need further changes, you know where to find me," he said. The late afternoon air outside was cool and carried the faint scent of roasting coffee from the cafe across the street. Ruby tucked her arm through Helen's as they walked back to the car. Helen's phone buzzed before they reached it. She pulled it from her coat pocket. A text from David. "We need to talk about your place soon." She stared at the glowing screen, the new will's sealed envelope still warm in her other hand. Helen was still deciding whether to make tea or coffee when the knock came, sharp, 3 quick raps that carried a certain entitlement. She opened the door to find David and Melissa standing there. Melissa in a camel-colored coat that looked brand new, David with his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "Surprise," Melissa said brightly, stepping in before Helen could answer. David followed, his gaze drifting immediately over the living room. Helen closed the door slowly, the quiet click loud in the small space. "I wasn't expecting company." Melissa's perfume, something sugary with an artificial floral edge, mingled with the faint scent of the lemon bars Ruby had left on the counter. "We were in the neighborhood," Melissa said, eyes scanning the room. Helen noticed the moment Melissa's gaze landed on the attorney's envelope resting on the end table beside Helen's knitting basket. The envelope was still sealed, its crisp white surface catching a slant of afternoon light from the window. Melissa's hand moved toward it like a cat to a dangling string. "Oh, what's this?" Helen reached out first, sliding the envelope smoothly into the knitting basket, tucking it between a skein of soft gray wool and the half-finished scarf she'd been working on. "Just some papers." Melissa's smile didn't falter, but it thinned. "Papers can be important." Helen crossed to the kitchen without answering, the hardwood floor cool beneath her slippers. She filled the kettle, the metal lid clinking lightly, and set it on the stove. Behind her she could hear David moving, the faint squeak of the couch cushions as he sat, then the creak of the floorboards as he stood again. Melissa followed Helen into the kitchen, her tone shifting into something almost sing-song. "You know, I've been thinking about the future. Our future. It's always better when families have arrangements in place. Makes things smoother." Helen stirred sugar into her mug, her face unreadable. "Arrangements have a way of changing." Melissa laughed, but it was a shade too high too quick. "Well, sure. But some things like property, those are better settled early." From the living room David's voice carried in. "This building's gotta be worth a fortune now. Prime spot. I bet you could get double what it was 10 years ago." Helen set the spoon down gently, the soft clink against ceramic louder than his words. She turned to find him standing near the bookshelf, eyes moving from framed photographs to the small antique clock she'd inherited from her mother. He was looking at everything the way a buyer studies a house before making an offer. "Would you like tea?" Helen asked, her tone so neutral it could have been mistaken for polite hospitality. Neither of them answered right away. The kettle whistled, a sharp note that seemed to slice through the thickening air. Helen poured the water slowly, the steam rising in soft curls, carrying the faint scent of chamomile. She placed one mug on the counter in front of Melissa without looking at her. They stayed for 20 more minutes, making the kind of small talk that sat heavy between them. Helen offered no openings, no hints, and certainly no explanations. By the time they left, Melissa's smile had cooled into something brittle, and David's goodbye was more of a mutter than a farewell. That evening, the apartment felt quieter than usual. Helen settled into her chair with her knitting basket at her side, the envelope still nestled inside. Outside, the park lights had clicked on, bathing the mossy oaks in a soft amber glow. She was halfway through a row of stitches when the phone rang. The caller ID made her pause. Melissa. Helen considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity nudged her. She answered, keeping her voice steady. "Listen," Melissa said, her tone stripped of its earlier sweetness. "If you cut him out, cut me in instead." The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. Helen held the phone to her ear just long enough for Melissa's words, sharp, almost whispered, to finish sliding through the receiver. Then she pressed her thumb to the red button and let the line go dead. No good night, no argument, no acknowledgement, The silence afterward was almost pleasant, like a door shutting on a draft. The phone buzzed again within minutes. She didn't pick up. By the next morning there were two new voicemails. David's voice filled the first, tight with anger, but trying to sound measured. "Mom, I don't know what Melissa said to you, but whatever's going on, we need to talk. This is getting ridiculous." The second was sharper. "You can't just ignore me. I'm your son. For God's sake, call me back." Helen deleted both without listening to the ends. Before she could put the phone down, it lit up with a message from Ruby Coffee. "My treat. 10 minutes." The cafe across from Forsyth Park was small, its windows fogged from the steam of espresso machines inside. The air was warm and rich with the scent of roasted beans and fresh pastries. Ruby was already at a table near the window, her scarf tossed over the chair, two steaming mugs between them. "You look like a woman who's slept well," Ruby said as Helen sat. "Better than I have in months," Helen replied, wrapping her hands around the mug. The ceramic's heat seeped into her fingers. They drank in comfortable silence for a moment, watching dog walkers pass, collars jingling, leashes taut against the wind. A man in a knit cap paused to let his beagle sniff the edge of the park fence. Ruby finally spoke. "So are we talking about it?" Helen arched a brow. "About what?" "The call you didn't take." Ruby's eyes glinted over the rim of her cup. Helen sipped her coffee, letting the bitter heat linger on her tongue before setting it down. "Let's just say I'm not interested in entertaining side offers." Ruby laughed, low and approving. "Good. Parasites don't deserve bargaining rights." The rest of the hour passed with talk of Ruby's garden and the early bloom of camellias in the park. The world outside kept moving, cars rumbling past, leaves whispering underfoot, but Helen felt a stillness settling in her bones, a steadying of the ground beneath her. Later at the clinic, Janine noticed immediately. "You're in a good mood today," she said, adjusting Helen's arm for the needle. Helen looked out the window at the pale winter sun, filtering through the blinds. "I'm taking care of business." Janine grinned. "About time." The whir of the dialysis machine filled the space between them, steady and mechanical, like a reminder that some things could be managed, controlled, kept running smoothly, if you took the trouble to maintain them. By the time Helen left the clinic, the sky had shifted to a silvery blue, the kind that made the moss in the park glow faintly against the fading light. She walked home slowly, the cold air nipping at her cheeks, her scarf pulled close. Inside her apartment, the envelope from Alan was still in the knitting basket. She touched it briefly before sitting down to finish the scarf, the rhythmic pull of yarn through her fingers soothing. Her phone buzzed on the side table, a text from David. "We need to meet urgently." Helen stared at it for a long moment, her needles paused mid-loop, the scarf draped over her lap like a question she had no intention of answering right away. The cafe on Whitaker Street smelled of fresh espresso and cinnamon, its narrow tables pressed close enough together that conversations seemed to lean into each other. Helen arrived first, claiming a table by the window where the late morning light spilled across the wood. She kept her coat on, hands wrapped around a mug, the steam curling softly upward. David and Melissa appeared 5 minutes later, Melissa leading the way, sunglasses still on despite the overcast sky. David trailed behind, his shoulders tense. Melissa slid into the chair across from Helen, setting her bag down with a thump. "We need to talk." Helen nodded once. "So I gathered." Melissa leaned forward, her perfume cutting through the scent of coffee. "What's going on with the will?" Helen sipped her drink, then set it down deliberately. "My will is my business." David shifted uncomfortably. Melissa gave a short, humorless laugh. "Family should come first." Helen's gaze didn't waver. "Sometimes family forgets to act like family." Melissa opened her mouth, but before she could reply, the bell over the door jingled. Ruby walked in, the bright blue of her scarf vivid against the cafe's muted tones. She spotted Helen immediately, and crossed the room. "Morning," Ruby said, sliding into the chair beside her. The warmth of her presence felt like a wall sliding into place. Melissa's smile froze mid-curve. "Oh, you're here." Ruby didn't bother returning the smile. "And you're here too. What a coincidence." David glanced between them, clearly uneasy. Melissa's tone sharpened. This is a private conversation. Then maybe you should have had it somewhere private, Ruby said, stirring sugar into her coffee after the server set it down. Helen remained silent, letting the tension braid itself tighter across the table. The sound of milk frothing from the espresso machine filled the pause, along with the faint chatter of the couple at the next table. Melissa tried again, her voice dropping lower. Look, if there's something we've done. Helen cut in, her tone calm but immovable. This isn't about what you think you're owed. It's about what I choose to leave behind. David's jaw tightened. Melissa's eyes narrowed just slightly, the smallest crack in her carefully arranged composure. Ruby set her cup down, the soft click louder than it should have been. I think you've got your answer, she said, leaning back in her chair. Melissa pushed her sunglasses back on as if to shield herself. We'll see about that, she murmured, standing so abruptly her chair legs scraped against the floor. David followed, giving Helen one last look that carried equal parts frustration and disbelief, before trailing after his wife. The cafe's noise seemed to swell in their absence, the grind of beans, the clink of cups, the hiss of steam, like the room itself had been holding its breath. Ruby reached across the table and touched Helen's hand briefly. You handled that well. Helen allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. I didn't give them anything to work with. Later that evening, as Helen sat in her living room with a book in her lap, her phone chimed. She didn't have to open the notification to know it was trouble. Melissa's name flashing across the top, followed by a snippet of text. Melissa Mercer has posted. Some people show their true colors when they smell money. The post had no names, no direct accusation, but Helen knew exactly who it was meant for. Anyone who'd been following the family long enough could connect the dots. Within hours, the comments had begun piling up. Spill the tea. Ugh. I hate greed in families. If they can't be fair, cut them out. Melissa replied to a few with cryptic heart emojis and exactly's feeding the fire without ever giving specifics. Helen closed the laptop and made tea instead. The kettle's whistle sounded calmer than anything she'd seen online that day. But the messages started arriving that afternoon, trickling in like slow leaks in a roof. First, a cousin she hadn't spoken to in years. Is everything okay? Melissa's post seemed pointed. Then a woman from her knitting circle. I hope whatever's going on with the family is being resolved fairly. And finally, an old library colleague she hadn't worked with in over a decade. You've always been such a kind soul, Helen. I hope no one's taking advantage of you. Helen read each one twice, then set the phone down beside her mug. The urge to defend herself came and went in a single breath. She typed the same reply to all three. I'm not discussing it. By the second day, the post had slipped down most people's feeds, but the gossip it had stirred was still floating in the air. Helen could tell from the little signs, people liking old photos of hers from months ago, mutual acquaintances sending her vague check-in messages. Ruby noticed too. She arrived that afternoon with a paper sack of groceries, lemons, tea, a loaf of fresh bread still warm enough to fog its paper wrapping. She set the bag on the counter with a thud. Your silence, Ruby said, pulling out the bread, is driving her insane. Helen arched a brow. Melissa? Who else? Ruby sliced off an end piece of bread and popped it into her mouth. She's posted 3 more times about loyalty and betrayal in the last 24 hours. No names, but come on. Everyone knows. Helen smiled faintly. And I suppose she wants me to say something so she can twist it. Ruby pointed at her with the bread knife. Exactly. The more you stay quiet, the more she flails. That evening, Helen chose the novel she'd been meaning to start for weeks, settling into her armchair with a thick blanket over her knees. The apartment was warm, the lamps casting a soft honey light. Outside, Forsyth Park was dark, except for the fountain, the spray catching the glow of the street lamps in quick silver flashes. The phone chimed mid-chapter. An email from Alan. Helen, just confirming that the will revision is now fully executed and stored. Your copy is valid and complete. She read it twice before closing her laptop. There was nothing to say back, and nothing to add. It was done. The hours slipped by easily. The tick of the wall clock filled the spaces between page turns. Occasionally a bus rumbled past outside, but it was faint, almost comforting. By the time she set the book down, it was after 10. She rinsed her mug in the sink, turned off the kitchen light, and was halfway to the bedroom when the phone lit up again. This time it wasn't an email or a benign check-in. It was a text from Melissa. "I know what you did." The words glared from the screen, sharp and certain. Helen stood in the half-lit hallway, thumb hovering over the phone, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the apartment. She didn't answer. Not yet. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked between the grocery store flyer and an alumni newsletter she never read. Helen almost tossed it into the recycling until she noticed the return address, Chatham County Tax Assessor's Office. Inside, a single-page notice and a check for $312.48, refund for overpayment of property taxes. The paper smelled faintly of printer toner, the check itself crisp and pale blue, the kind of money that didn't change lives, but still made you feel you'd gotten away with something. She set it on the kitchen counter, next to her mug of tea, and allowed herself a small smile. Not because of the amount, but because of what it represented. Ownership, independence, something untouched by David's or Melissa's reach. That afternoon, she walked to the bank. The air was cool but carried the faint sweetness of camellias blooming early in Forsyth Park. Her cane tapped softly against the sidewalk as she passed the fountain, its water glittering under a pale winter sun. Inside the bank, the faint scent of floor polish mixed with the distant hum of a printer. The teller, a young woman with neatly braided hair, smiled as Helen slid the check across the counter. "Deposit, please." Once the transaction was done, Helen stepped back into the sunlight, the weight of the deposit slip in her pocket somehow more satisfying than the check itself. That evening, Ruby dropped by unannounced, carrying a tray of cuttings in small ceramic pots. She set them on the table, brushing soil from her hands. "Money better spent on plants than people," she said with a wink. Helen chuckled. "Plants don't call you asking for favors." Ruby's grin widened. "And they don't post about you on Facebook." It had been nearly a week since Melissa's last public jab. David's calls had slowed to a trickle. 2 in the past 5 days, both unanswered. Helen had stopped counting how many she deleted without listening to. On Thursday, the sky was so clear, Helen decided to take the long way home from the clinic. She walked slowly through the park, her scarf snug at her neck. Joggers passed in bright flashes of color. A street musician near the fountain played something soft on a saxophone. The air carried the faint brine of the nearby river. It was there, standing under the shade of a massive live oak, that her phone buzzed. "Hello, Helen." Alan's voice came warm and measured through the line. "Just checking in. I wanted to make sure you're satisfied with the changes we made." Helen's eyes tracked a child chasing a red ball across the grass. "More than satisfied," she said. "Good," Alan replied. "You've done the hard part deciding. Now you can just live." They exchanged a few pleasantries before hanging up, the conversation as neat and efficient as his office. By the time she reached her apartment, the afternoon light had shifted to gold spilling across the wooden floors. She put on a kettle, and was just pulling down the tin of Earl Grey when Ruby called. "Don't hang up," Ruby said immediately. "I just heard something from Janice down the block. You know, the one with the bird feeders." Helen smiled faintly. "She always knows everything. She says David and Melissa are having problems." Helen's hand paused on the teapot lid. "What kind of problem?" Ruby lowered her voice as if the walls could hear. "The kind that get loud. Neighbors say they've been arguing about money." Helen set the lid down gently. Outside, the park lamps were just beginning to flicker on, their amber glow stretching shadows across the grass. For the first time in weeks, she felt a genuine flicker of curiosity about David, not out of concern, but because she knew a shift was coming, and shifts had a way of opening new doors. The knock on her door was sharp enough to rattle the picture frame hanging beside it. Helen opened it to find Melissa standing there alone, cheeks flushed, hair pulled into a tight knot that looked like it had been done in a hurry. The air between them carried the faintest trace of Melissa's perfume, layered over something more human, an edge of nervous sweat. Helen, Melissa began, skipping any pleasantries. We need to talk. Helen stepped back just enough to let her in, not enough to make it an invitation. Melissa crossed the threshold quickly, glancing around as if expecting an audience. Put me back in the will. The words came out flat, like she'd rehearsed them on the drive over. Helen shut the door, her hand resting on the knob for a moment before she turned. That's not going to happen. Melissa's jaw tightened. I'm family. You can't just erase me like I'm nothing. Helen moved to the armchair and sat, smoothing the blanket across her lap with deliberate care. Melissa, I'm not erasing you. I'm choosing what happens to what's mine. That's my right. Melissa's voice rose a notch. You're making a mistake. You think those charities are going to care about you when you're gone? They'll spend it all on overhead and coffee machines. Helen's gaze was steady, her tone unshaken. I've made my choice. The silence stretched between them, thick enough to touch. Outside, a bus rumbled past, its brakes hissing. Melissa broke first, her lips curling into something halfway between a sneer and a smile. Fine, but don't expect anyone to be around when you need them. I'll take my chances, Helen said softly. Melissa's eyes narrowed, as if trying to find a crack in Helen's composure. When she didn't find one, she spun toward the door. The slam reverberated through the apartment, setting the picture frame trembling again. Helen exhaled, leaning back into the chair. The air still held Melissa's perfume, sharp and lingering. It was less than a minute later when another knock came, this one lighter, rhythmic, familiar. Helen opened the door to find Ruby on the other side, cradling a still warm loaf of bread in a tea towel. Brought you something, Ruby said, stepping inside without hesitation. Sourdough, perfect with butter. Helen smiled. Your timing is uncanny. Ruby raised an eyebrow as she set the bread on the counter. What happened? Melissa was just here. Ruby let out a low whistle. And she wanted back in the will. Helen's voice carried no trace of the earlier tension, only a certain finality. Ruby laughed, shaking her head. She must think persistence is a virtue. They cut into the bread together, the crust cracking under the knife, releasing a warm, yeasty aroma that filled the small kitchen. Helen spread butter across a slice, the golden melt sinking into the porous surface. To good timing, Ruby said, holding her slice like a toast. To better company, Helen replied. They ate at the counter, the sound of the park drifting in through the open kitchen window. Children's laughter, a faint saxophone somewhere near the fountain. The tension of Melissa's visit dissolved into something lighter, replaced by the comfort of shared food and unhurried conversation. As Ruby was rinsing her plate, her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at the screen, and her expression shifted from casual to wide-eyed. It's from Janice, she said, holding up the phone. You won't believe this. Helen waited, butter knife still in hand. They broke up. The words hung in the air, unexpected and strangely. Helen was halfway through buttering a piece of Ruby's sourdough the next afternoon when the phone rang. The caller ID made her pause. David. She debated letting it go to voicemail, but answered, curiosity outweighing habit. Mom. David's voice came through, strained, the edges frayed. Melissa's gone. Helen didn't speak right away, letting him fill the space. She moved out yesterday, he continued. Packed her stuff while I was at work. Took the car. I guess she's been planning it. Helen placed the bread back on the plate, her knife resting beside it. I see. There was a long pause on his end before he said, I think we should, start fresh. You and me, put all this behind us. Helen leaned back in her chair, eyes drifting to the park outside her window. A child was flying a bright red kite, the wind tugging it sharply against the pale sky. We can start fresh, she said finally. But the will is final. David's exhale was sharp, almost a scoff. I'm not calling about the will. No, Helen said softly. But you were hoping it might come up. Silence on the line, broken only by the faint sound of a dog barking somewhere on his end. Guess I'll see you around, Mom, he said at last, before hanging up. Not an hour later, her phone chimed again, this time a notification from Facebook. Melissa had posted another Barb status. Some people will use you until they can't anymore, then act like they never needed you. The comment section was already swelling with sympathetic replies. Helen didn't type a word. That evening Ruby called. "Dinner at my place tonight? I've got a pie cooling on the counter, and you're not allowed to say no." Helen smiled into the receiver. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Ruby's house smelled of rosemary and butter when Helen arrived. The dining table was already set, candles flickering in mismatched holders. They ate roasted chicken, potatoes crisped at the edges, and green beans with slivers of almonds. The pie, blueberry, with a lattice crust, was still warm enough that the filling bled slightly onto the plates. They laughed more than Helen expected, about Ruby's neighbor who kept accidentally mowing too far onto her lawn, about the time Ruby had tried to make her own pickles, and nearly set off the smoke detector. By the time Helen set down her fork, the air in the room felt lighter than it had in weeks. She leaned back in her chair, letting the warmth of the wine and company settle into her bones. The phone in her coat pocket buzzed. She almost ignored it, but when she pulled it out, the screen showed a number she recognized immediately. Alan's office. She answered, tucking the phone to her ear. Alan's voice was steady, deliberate. "Helen, I've been reviewing your file. Now that the will's been fully executed, would you like to redirect more of your assets to charity?" The candlelight caught in the stem of her wine glass, and for a moment she just watched it shimmer. Helen sat in Alan's office again, sunlight slanting through the tall windows and pooling in warm golden rectangles across the walnut desk. The faint smell of leather-bound volumes and old paper hung in the air, grounding the room in a sense of permanence, a stark contrast to the impermanence of her decisions. Alan adjusted his reading glasses and looked at her over the rims. "So," he said, "have you decided?" Helen rested her hands on her lap. "Yes. I want to leave a large portion to the Savannah Literacy Fund." One of Alan's eyebrows ticked upward. "That's a worthy choice." "You're certain?" "I spent most of my life in libraries," Helen said. "If someone can't read, they can't choose their own future. I'd rather give them that than leave money to people who've already shown me what they'd do with it." Alan gave a single approving nod before pulling a fresh document toward him. The scratch of his fountain pen filled the silence as he began to write. Ruby sat in the chair beside Helen, her scarf looped twice around her neck despite the mild day. She caught Helen's eye and gave her an approving half-smile, one that said, "You're doing exactly the right thing." When the document was ready, Alan turned it so Helen could read. She scanned each line carefully, the printed words confirming what she'd already decided in her mind. David and Melissa's names nowhere in sight, the literacy fund prominent in its place. Helen signed, the pen gliding smoothly across the page. Alan swiveled the paper toward Ruby. "If you'll witness again." Ruby took the pen without hesitation, adding her looping signature beneath Helen's. "Happy to." The papers slid into a protective sleeve before Alan crossed the room to the tall file cabinet. The metallic click of the lock sounded final. "Done," he said, returning to hand Helen her sealed copy. "This version supersedes all others." Helen slipped the envelope into her tote bag, feeling the faint texture of the paper under her palm. "It feels good," she admitted. Alan leaned back in his chair. "It should. You've taken control of your story." When they stepped outside, the afternoon had brightened into one of those Savannah days where the sky looked freshly painted, every cloud brushed thin and high. The air was warm for the season, carrying the faint scent of blooming camellias from a nearby garden. They walked slowly toward Ruby's car, passing a couple holding hands and laughing, a street vendor selling pralines from a cart, the sweet scent curling into the breeze. Helen let the warmth of the sun sink into her shoulders, the decision sitting lighter in her chest than she'd expected. Ruby unlocked the car, but instead of getting in, she reached into her bag for her phone. "Oh," she said, glancing at the screen, "you need to see this." Helen tilted her head. "What is it?" "It's from Laura. Remember her? Used to run the little bookshop near Broughton Street." Helen nodded slowly. "I remember." Ruby's eyes sparkled as she turned the phone so Helen could read the message. "You won't believe who's getting married." Helen leaned against Ruby's car, squinting at the phone Ruby had just handed her. The message from Laura blinked back at her. Ruby scrolled down to the second line. "It's Melissa," she said, her voice a mixture of disbelief and glee. "Apparently she's engaged. Some guy she's known for, get this, 6 weeks. Helen's first reaction was a quiet laugh, low and almost inaudible over the chatter of tourists passing on the sidewalk. "Well," she murmured, "she does move quickly when she sees an opportunity." They drove back to Helen's apartment in companionable silence, the kind that felt more like mutual amusement than shock. The live oaks along the road swayed gently, the sunlight breaking through in brief, warm flashes. That evening, just as Helen was setting a book on the arm of her chair, the phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but the moment she answered, David's voice, tight, trembling, filled the line. "Mom, I just heard about Melissa. I can't believe she'd do this." His words came in quick bursts, like he was pacing while speaking. "After everything I did for her, after everything we—" Helen said nothing, letting the pauses lengthen. "And you're still cutting me out? After all this?" His voice cracked slightly. "I'm your son. That has to mean something." She leaned back into her chair, the cool fabric pressing against her shoulders. Through the open window, she could hear faint music drifting from the park, someone strumming a guitar near the fountain. "Helen? Are you even listening?" She was. But she didn't answer. After a long, thin stretch of silence, David muttered something she didn't catch and hung up. The abrupt click felt like the end of a chapter she'd been ready to close for a long time. Minutes later, Ruby knocked, 3 gentle taps this time, and stepped onto the porch, holding 2 tall glasses of sweet tea, beads of condensation running down the sides. "To your decisiveness," Ruby said, lifting her glass. Helen clinked hers lightly in return. "And to peace of mind." They sat on the porch, the boards warm under their feet, watching the park lamps flicker on one by one. The sweet tea was cold and syrupy, the kind that left a faint stickiness on her fingertips. Later inside, Helen retrieved the envelope Alan had given her and set it on her desk. She pulled out her checkbook and with deliberate strokes wrote her first donation to the Savannah Literacy Fund. The numbers felt good in ink, solid, final. She tucked the check into a cream-colored envelope, sealing it with a firm press of her thumb. As she set it aside for mailing, a soft calm settled over her, a sense of having placed a stone in exactly the right spot to keep the path steady. She was still sitting there when her phone buzzed again, this time with an unknown number. Expecting a telemarketer, she almost ignored it. But curiosity won, and she swiped to answer. "Hello, is this Helen Mercer?" The voice was warm, male and unfamiliar. "Yes, it is. My name's Daniel. I'm Melissa's fiancé." Helen straightened slightly, the cool weight of surprise settling in her chest. "I see. I know this might sound strange," he continued, "but Melissa told me a lot about you. I'd like you to come to our wedding. It's just going to be at the courthouse. Small, simple. I think it would mean a lot to her if you were there." Helen let the words hang in the air for a moment, the irony of the invitation curling through her thoughts like smoke. The Savannah courthouse was all red brick and white columns, its front steps dotted with people dressed just a touch better than usual. A man in a pressed shirt without a tie, a woman in a sundress with a cardigan. Helen stood at the base of the steps, the winter sun warming her coat just enough to soften the chill. She spotted Melissa instantly. A cream knee-length dress, hair swept into loose curls, makeup carefully done but not overdone. Melissa's eyes widened in surprise, before breaking into a bright smile that felt different, lighter, almost uncalculated. "Helen, you came," she said, stepping forward to hug her. Helen let the hug happen, feeling the faint scent of vanilla and hairspray wrap around her. Daniel, tall with a warm grin, joined them. "Thank you for coming," he said sincerely, his handshake firm but not showy. Inside, the courtroom had been repurposed for weddings, rows of folding chairs, a small arch draped in white fabric, and a table holding a single bouquet of fresh lilies. The air smelled faintly of polish and flowers. Helen took a seat near the aisle, The ceremony began quickly. No music beyond the shuffle of feet and the judge's even voice. Melissa and Daniel held hands, leaning in to hear each word. Helen found herself watching Melissa's face, not for cracks, but for signs of performance. Strangely, she didn't see any. When the vows came, Melissa's voice didn't waver. Daniel's followed, steady and sure. A quick exchange of rings, a kiss, and it was done. The handful of guests clapped politely, and the couple turned to make their way down the aisle, grinning like they were stepping into the sun. Ruby appeared at Helen's elbow, camera in hand. "Don't look at me like that," she whispered. "You know I can't resist documenting a spectacle." Helen smiled faintly. "It's not a spectacle. It's something else." After a flurry of photos on the courthouse steps, the group migrated to a cafe tucked into a corner of the historic district. The space was warm and fragrant with the scent of fresh bread and simmering soup, sunlight spilling through the tall windows onto the mismatched tables. They all squeezed around a long wooden table, Melissa and Daniel at the center, Helen and Ruby on one side, a few of Daniel's friends and relatives on the other. Glasses of sweet tea and wine clinked. Menus were passed. At one point, Daniel leaned toward Helen. "Melissa told me you're a reader," he said. "I've been meaning to get back into books myself." Helen sipped her tea, the ice clinking softly. "Books are good company," she replied. "They don't expect anything but your attention." He smiled at that. Halfway through the meal, shrimp and grits for Helen, a slice of pecan pie already earmarked for dessert. Melissa stood. "I think we should hear something from Helen," she said, glancing her way. Helen set down her fork. "I suppose I can manage a few words." She looked around the table, letting her eyes rest briefly on each face before returning to the newlyweds. New beginnings aren't always clean or easy, but they can be exactly what's needed. My wish for you both is that you meet each day with honesty, patience, and when needed, a little humor. It goes further than you think. There was a murmur of agreement, a few claps, the warm sound of wine glasses toasting. Ruby snapped a photo just as Helen lifted her glass. Laughter wove in and out of the conversation for the rest of the lunch. Ruby managed to catch Melissa mid-laugh more than once, and even Helen found herself smiling at stories she'd never heard before. Small human details that had nothing to do with old grudges. As plates were cleared and the sunlight began to tilt toward late afternoon, Melissa leaned toward Helen, her voice low but warm. "I'm glad you're family now," she said. Helen didn't answer right away, but the weight of the moment, unexpected and almost disarming, settled between them like a pause in a story. The morning sun slanted through the blinds as Helen buttoned her coat. Her appointment bag, scarf, reading glasses, paperback, and a small bottle of hand lotion sat by the door, packed without rush. The day felt unhurried, almost indulgent. Forsyth Park was waking as she walked through it. Joggers moved in rhythmic strides, a man tossed crumbs to pigeons near the fountain, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth and blooming camellias. Helen's cane tapped lightly on the path, matching her steady pace toward the clinic. Inside, the familiar low hum of machines and the faint tang of antiseptic greeted her. Janine was at the reception desk, flipping through a chart, her hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. "Well, look who's early and smiling," Janine said, waving her over. Helen settled into her usual recliner, the vinyl cool against her palms. "It's a good day." Janine slipped the blood pressure cuff around Helen's arm, the Velcro closing with a soft rip. "Your numbers are looking good today. Keep this up and you might make me obsolete." Helen chuckled. "Don't threaten me with progress." The treatment passed in quiet efficiency. She read a few chapters of her book, pausing occasionally to watch the slow movement of the drip, the measured precision of the machine. No calls, no text demanding her attention. Just the steady rhythm of her own breathing, and the soft murmur of nurses speaking to other patients. When it was over, Janine unhooked her with practiced ease. "You're doing better than last month," she said, handing Helen her coat. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." Outside, the sunlight was brighter, glinting off car roofs and the damp edges of the sidewalk. Helen decided to walk the 2 blocks to the cafe, rather than call Ruby just yet. The bell above the cafe door chimed as she stepped inside, the air warm and fragrant with espresso and baked sugar. She ordered a fresh croissant, the pastry still warm, its layers crisp and buttery beneath her fingers. She sat near the window, tearing off small bites, letting the crumbs fall onto the plate as she watched people drift through the park across the street. 5 minutes later, Ruby arrived, her scarf trailing behind her like a bright ribbon. She slid into the seat opposite Helen, setting down her coffee with a satisfied sigh. "Look at you," Ruby said, radiating smug contentment. Helen smiled. "Dialysis was good, numbers are up. No family drama, at least for the morning." Ruby raised her paper cup in a small toast. To good mornings. They sat watching the fountain in the park, the spray catching the sunlight so it seemed to glitter in midair. A little girl in a yellow coat ran circles around its base, while her father tried to keep up, laughter carrying faintly through the glass. Helen sipped her coffee, the bitterness balancing perfectly with the last bite of croissant. She felt no lingering tension, no weight on her shoulders. "You know," Ruby said after a moment, "I think you've finally done it." "Done what?" "Built a life without the wrong people taking up space." Helen let the words settle between them like a warm blanket. Through the cafe window she could see the oaks swaying gently, their moss trailing like green lace in the breeze. The day seemed full but unhurried, the kind of day that asked nothing from her but presence. She leaned back in her chair, feeling the quiet satisfaction of choices made and kept. Some absences, she thought, weren't losses at all. "Some absences make room for better company," she said aloud, and Ruby's answering smile made the truth of it settle deep in her bones.